The process started with careful mushroom identification and harvesting. Different varieties had different seasons, and experienced foragers knew exactly when and where to find the best specimens. Once safely harvested, the mushrooms were cleaned and chopped finely, then often sautéed briefly to remove excess moisture. Oats served as the binding base, providing substance and helping hold the cakes together during cooking. Oats were the medieval equivalent of breadcrumbs, except they were more nutritious and easier to grow. Mashed vegetables were often added to extend the mixture and provide additional nutrients. When available, eggs were incorporated to help bind the cakes together, creating firmer patties that held their shape better during cooking. Garlic and herbs like thyme or parsley were common additions that enhanced the overall flavor profile. The cakes were formed by hand into flat patties and pan-fried in whatever fat was available. The cooking process created crispy exteriors while keeping the interiors moist and flavorful. Regional pride probably led to heated debates about whose mushroom cakes were superior, though nobody wanted to be wrong about mushroom identification. Different regions developed their own variations based on local mushroom varieties and available ingredients. The difference between a delicious dinner and a fatal mistake often came down to proper mushroom identification, making this one of the more dangerous medieval cooking adventures. The seasonal nature of mushroom foraging meant that these cakes were often associated with specific times of year, creating anticipation when mushroom season arrived and families could once again enjoy these hearty treats. Just as these forest ingredients fed families inland, coastal communities developed their own ways to make the most of their aquatic resources. Coastal communities and riverside settlements knew something that modern grocery shoppers have forgotten. The parts of fish we throw away are often the most nutritious. Fish heads, bones, and scraps weren't waste products in medieval kitchens. They were valuable ingredients that could feed entire families for days. Making stew from fish heads might sound like the kind of thing you'd only eat on a dare, but medieval cooks turned these throwaway parts into genuinely delicious meals. The key was understanding that fish heads contain incredible amounts of gelatin, healthy fats, and nutrients that modern supplements try to replicate. The process began with whatever fish scraps were available: heads from cleaning the catch, bones left over from filleting, or sometimes whole small fish that weren't worth selling at market. These would go into large iron pots with leeks, onions, and parsley, then covered with water and left to simmer slowly over the fire. Hours of slow cooking were essential for breaking down the tough connective tissues and extracting maximum nutrition from the bones. Medieval cooks learned that rushing this process resulted in tough, unpalatable messes, while patience produced silky, rich stews that satisfied both hunger and nutritional needs. The finished stew was typically served with barley or thick slices of black bread for soaking up the flavorful broth. Different coastal regions developed their own variations based on local fish varieties and available vegetables. Fish head stew was particularly popular during religious fasting periods when meat was forbidden, but fish was allowed. The Catholic Church's complex dietary rules created opportunities for creative cooking, and resourceful cooks made sure nothing edible went to waste. The smell alone could probably guide lost fishermen back to shore. Fishing communities often made these stews communally, with several families contributing their scraps to create large batches that could feed everyone. While coastal communities maximized their aquatic resources, inland areas developed equally resourceful approaches to creating filling meals from simple, readily available ingredients. Eggs were precious commodities in medieval households, too valuable to eat carelessly, but too nutritious to ignore entirely. When families did splurge on using eggs for cooking rather than selling them at market, they made sure every shell crack counted. The filling started with leeks, which grew easily in medieval gardens and provided both bulk and flavor without breaking the household budget. Leeks were basically nature's way of helping poor families feel fancy without spending fancy money. These were chopped finely and often cooked slightly before being mixed with beaten eggs to create a custard-like base. Cheese was added when families could afford it, usually whatever local variety was available and reasonably priced. Hard cheeses worked best because they didn't turn the filling watery during baking, and their strong flavors meant a little went a long way. The pastry crust was made from flour and water, sometimes enriched with a bit of lard or butter when the budget allowed. Medieval bakers had to work with whatever fats they could obtain, and lard from the family pig was often the most practical choice. Baking methods vary considerably based on available equipment. Wealthy households with proper ovens could create evenly baked pies with golden crusts, while poorer families often used covered pots with hot coals placed on top to simulate oven conditions. This makeshift baking method worked surprisingly well, though it required more attention than watching paint dry. Herbs like parsley, chives, or even wild garlic were commonly added to enhance the flavor and provide extra nutrition. These additions transformed simple egg and leek combinations into more complex, satisfying meals. Leek and egg pie was particularly popular in monasteries, where religious dietary restrictions required creative approaches to nutrition. The combination of protein from eggs, vitamins from leeks, and carbohydrates from the crust created balanced meals that sustained hard-working medieval families. While eggs provided valuable protein for those who could afford them, practical medieval cooks also created portable foods that could sustain travelers during long journeys. Medieval travelers faced a serious problem that modern people with their gas stations and drive-thrus can barely comprehend: how to carry enough food for journeys that might last weeks or months. Regular bread would mold, meat would spoil, and most cooked foods would become inedible within days. These weren't the kind of cakes you'd sing happy birthday over. They were more like edible armor plating that happened to contain nutrients. The goal was creating something that could survive being bounced around in saddlebags, withstand temperature changes, and still provide decent nutrition after weeks of storage. The base was typically flour mixed with lard or rendered fat, which served multiple purposes. The fat provided concentrated calories essential for travelers burning energy walking or riding all day, helped preserve the cakes by excluding air, and made the final product more palatable than plain flour and water would have been. Tiny pieces of bacon or salted pork were mixed into the dough, adding protein and flavor, while the salt content helped with preservation. The bacon pieces had to be small enough not to make the cakes fall apart, but large enough that you could actually taste them. Once mixed, the dough was formed into flat, dense cakes and baked until they were completely dried out. The finished products were hard enough to use as emergency hammers, but they would last for months without refrigeration. Smart travelers would wrap their cakes in cloth or large leaves to protect them from moisture. When it came time to eat, many travelers would soften their cakes by soaking them in broth, ale, or even just water. Different regions developed their own travel cake recipes based on available ingredients and local preferences. These cakes represented medieval engineering at its finest, solving the problem of portable nutrition with ingredients that wouldn't quit on you halfway through a journey. While travelers needed portable foods for their journeys, rural communities facing food shortages learned to transform unlikely ingredients into nourishing staples. When regular grain supplies ran low, rural communities had to get creative about finding alternative sources of flour and calories. Acorns, which fell freely from oak trees every autumn, became valuable food sources for families who knew how to process them properly. The process was roughly as simple as teaching a cat to fetch, but it could mean the difference between eating and starving. Raw acorns contain high levels of tannins, bitter chemicals that are toxic in large quantities and make acorns completely inedible straight from the tree. The leaching process required patience and constant attention. Crushed acorns were placed in baskets and repeatedly washed with fresh water until the bitter taste disappeared. This could take days or even weeks, depending on the acorn variety. Once properly leached, the acorns were dried and ground into coarse flour using whatever grinding equipment was available, usually stone querns or even just rocks. The resulting flour was gritty and had a slightly nutty flavor that was quite different from wheat or barley flour. The biscuit-making process involved mixing acorn flour with animal fat or milk to form a workable dough. Water alone usually wasn't enough to bind the coarse flour properly, so some kind of fat was essential. These biscuits were typically baked on hot stones or in shallow pans over fires, since the coarse flour didn't rise like wheat flour would. The finished products were dense, flat, and had a distinctive nutty flavor that took some getting used to but provided genuine nutrition during lean times. Acorn flour was particularly valuable because it was completely free, nature's way of providing welfare benefits without the paperwork. Different oak varieties produced acorns with different flavors and tannin levels, and experienced foragers learned to identify the best varieties. The timing of acorn gathering was crucial. Too early and the nuts weren't mature. Too late and animals or other foragers had already claimed the best specimens. While acorn flour provided sustenance during difficult times, medieval cooks also created elaborate dishes that celebrated abundance and marked special occasions. Medieval mince pies bore little resemblance to the sweet holiday treats we know today. These were substantial, savory sweet creations that combined minced meat with dried fruits, spices, and vinegar in combinations that modern palates might find surprising. The meat component typically consisted of minced mutton or beef, often mixed with beef sweet for extra richness and preservation qualities. Sweet might sound unappetizing today, but it provided essential calories and helped preserve the meat filling for extended periods without refrigeration. Raisins and other dried fruits were expensive imports that added sweetness and exotic flavors to the pies. A handful of raisins probably cost more than most people's rent, so using them in pies was basically culinary showing off. These fruits also contributed natural preservatives that helped keep the meat filling safe to eat. Vinegar played a crucial role in both flavor and preservation. The acidic environment created by vinegar helped prevent spoilage while adding tangy notes that balanced the rich meat and sweet fruits. Spices transformed these pies from simple meat pastries into complex culinary creations. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and ginger were favorites when available, though each spice represented a significant investment. The pastry crust for these pies needed to be particularly robust. Medieval bakers created crusts so thick and sturdy they could probably withstand small earthquakes. Baking these pies required careful temperature control to ensure the meat cooked thoroughly while the crust didn't burn. The finished pies were often quite large and could feed entire families. They were typically served at feasts and celebrations when families wanted to showcase their prosperity. These pies were designed to last for weeks or even months when stored properly. The combination of cooked meat, acidic vinegar, sweet preservative fruits, and sealed pastry crust created remarkable preservation. While elaborate mince pies showcased medieval culinary sophistication, cooks also mastered simpler grain-based dishes that provided reliable nutrition. Frumenty held a special place in medieval cuisine as one of the few dishes that could be both everyday peasant food and aristocratic feast fare, depending on how it was prepared and what ingredients were added. The preparation began with whole wheat grains that needed to be cleaned carefully to remove chaff, stones, and other debris. This sorting process was like playing the world's most boring lottery, except instead of winning money, you avoided breaking your teeth. The wheat was then boiled in large quantities of water or, for special occasions, milk. This wasn't quick cooking. Whole wheat grains required hours of gentle simmering to become tender enough to eat comfortably. Milk-based frumenty was considered significantly more luxurious than water-based versions. The milk created a creamy, rich texture that transformed simple wheat grains into something genuinely indulgent. Sweetening came from honey when available, though families often had to make do with whatever natural sweeteners they could obtain. Dried fruits like raisins, currants, or chopped apples added both sweetness and texture. Some recipes called for egg yolks to be stirred in during the final stages of cooking, creating an even richer, more custard-like consistency. This technique required skill to prevent the eggs from scrambling. The cooking process required constant attention to prevent scorching and ensure even cooking. Different regions developed their own frumenty traditions based on local ingredients and preferences. Frumenty was particularly associated with religious feasts and celebrations, appearing regularly on Christmas tables and Easter dinners when families wanted to mark occasions with special foods. The nutritional value of frumenty was considerable, providing fiber, protein, and B vitamins that could sustain hardworking medieval families. While frumenty provided warming comfort during cold months, medieval communities also created beverages that combined nutrition with warming spices. Autumn in medieval times brought apple harvests that needed to be processed quickly before spoilage set in. Fresh apples wouldn't last through winter without preservation, so families fermented large quantities into cider. Cider making was probably the closest thing medieval people had to chemistry class, except the experiments were edible, and nobody got in trouble for drinking the results. The fermentation process happened naturally when crushed apples were left to sit. with wild yeasts converting the fruit sugars into alcohol. Medieval cider was quite different from modern versions. It was usually much less sweet and had a more complex, tart flavor that reflected the natural fermentation process. Spicing cider became an art form during autumn and winter months. Cloves, cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg were favorite additions when available. A single cinnamon stick probably cost more than most people's weekly wages, so using spices meant either celebrating something important or trying to impress visitors. The warming process required careful attention to avoid boiling the cider, which would cook off the alcohol and create harsh, bitter flavors. Medieval cooks learned to heat their spiced cider gently, just until steam began rising. Some recipes called for eggs or cream to be beaten into warm cider, creating rich, custard-like drinks that provided substantial nutrition along with warming comfort. Toast was commonly added to spiced cider, serving multiple purposes. The bread absorbed flavors from the cider while adding substance to what might otherwise be just a beverage. Different households developed their own secret spice combinations and serving rituals around spiced cider. Serving spiced cider became a social activity, especially during harvest festivals and autumn gatherings. While spiced drinks warmed bodies during cold months, medieval dairy workers also developed preservation techniques for fresh cheese. Fresh cheese spoiled quickly in medieval times, usually within days of being made, since refrigeration wouldn't exist for several more centuries. Creative dairy workers developed techniques using herbs and natural wrappings that could extend the life of soft cheeses. Getting the timing right required more precision than a medieval clockmaker, except clockmakers were rare and cheese was essential for survival. The cheese-making process began with milk that was curdled using vinegar, lemon juice, or natural rennet from animal stomachs. Once the curds formed properly, they were drained through cloth to remove excess whey. The pressing process had to remove enough moisture to create cheese that would hold together, but not so much that it became hard and dry. The herb wrapping technique served multiple purposes beyond simple preservation. Herbs like mint, thyme, sage, or wild garlic contain natural antimicrobial compounds that help prevent spoilage while infusing the cheese with distinctive flavors. Mint was particularly popular for wrapping soft cheeses because it grew easily in most regions and provided fresh, clean flavors. Thyme offered more complex, earthy notes, while wild garlic added pungent, savory flavors. The wrapping process required skill to ensure complete coverage without damaging the delicate cheese. Leaves had to be arranged carefully to exclude air while allowing some moisture to escape. The storage locations for wrapped cheeses required careful consideration. Cool, dry places worked best for preventing spoilage, while damp conditions could ruin even the best wrapped cheeses within hours. Different regions developed signature herb combinations that became associated with local cheese-making traditions. The timing of cheese-making is often coordinated with herb harvesting seasons and milk availability. While preserved cheeses provided protein that lasted for weeks, medieval cooks also created fresh dishes that showcased wild plants. Medieval people had a completely different relationship with bitter flavors than modern diners who've grown accustomed to sweet, processed foods. Wild greens like dandelion, mustard, and sorrel were appreciated for their sharp, complex flavors. These weren't the kind of salads you'd find at fancy restaurants. They were more like controlled experiments in eating weeds, except the weeds were actually good for you. Wild greens contained vitamins and minerals that were often lacking in grain-heavy medieval diets. Dandelion greens were particularly prized because they were available from early spring through late fall and grew abundantly in most regions. The bitter compounds were exactly what medieval people valued. These substances stimulated digestion. Mustard greens provided sharp, peppery flavors that added excitement to otherwise bland medieval meals. The intensity of mustard greens probably cleared sinuses more effectively than any medieval remedy, though the side effects were more pleasant. Sorrel contributed sour, lemony notes that brightened salads and provided vitamin C that helped prevent scurvy. This plant was particularly valuable because its tangy flavor made other bitter greens more palatable. The dressing for these salads was necessarily simple, since fancy oils and vinegars were expensive luxuries. Most families made do with whatever vinegar they could produce from leftover ale or wine. Ash salt represented medieval innovation at its finest. Regular salt was expensive enough to cause family disputes, so creative cooks learned to make their own salt by burning specific plants and collecting the mineral-rich ashes. The ash salt-making process involved burning dried plants completely, then soaking the ashes in water to dissolve the soluble salts. This homemade salt had a different flavor than modern table salt, more complex and earthy. Edible flowers often garnished these bitter green salads, adding color and mild flavors that help balance the intensity of the greens. While fresh wild greens provided nutrition during growing seasons, medieval families also relied on hearty grain-based dishes for winter sustenance. Medieval kitchens operated on the principle that nothing edible should ever be wasted, and barley stew with leftovers represented this philosophy in its purest form. This wasn't a recipe so much as a survival strategy. Throw everything into one pot and hope it turned into something edible by dinner time. Barley served as the foundation because it was cheap, filling, and could absorb flavors from whatever else went into the pot. The grain expanded significantly during cooking, meaning a small amount could feed large families when stretched with water and scraps. The beauty of this perpetual stew approach was its complete flexibility. Meat bones from previous meals added richness and nutrition, while vegetable scraps contributed flavors and vitamins. Even things that looked like they belonged in the compost pile often found their way into the stew pot instead. The cooking process was continuous rather than batch-based. Families would keep large iron pots simmering over their fires, adding new ingredients as they became available while ladling out servings for meals. Water had to be added regularly to replace what evaporated during cooking, while new ingredients kept the stew from becoming monotonous. The result was different every day, which was either exciting variety or culinary roulette, depending on your perspective and hunger level. Different households developed their own perpetual stew traditions based on available ingredients and family preferences. Some families specialized in herb combinations that improved the flavor, while others focused on maintaining proper consistency. The nutritional value of these stews was often quite good, since they incorporated scraps from many different food sources over time. Bones provide calcium and minerals, vegetables contribute vitamins, and grains offered carbohydrates. Maintaining a perpetual stew required skill and attention to prevent spoilage or off flavors from developing. The social aspects were significant too. Neighbors might contribute ingredients during abundant times, while families shared their stews during lean periods. The end of a perpetual stew usually coincided with major cleaning periods or seasonal changes, providing opportunities to begin fresh with different ingredient combinations. These 20 recipes show the incredible creativity of medieval cooks who turned simple ingredients into meals that kept entire communities alive. From bread that lasted weeks to stews that fed families for months, medieval cooking was equal parts survival skill and culinary art. Every technique represents generations of knowledge about making food last, taste good, and provide the nutrition needed for the demanding work of medieval life.